This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you're tuned in to an episode of When Science Speaks. Thanks so much for being here. Today's episode is brought to you by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists and engineers get funding, gain influence, and build relationships with the stakeholders who matter most in their professional environment. It is just so great to have Dr. Chiara Bertipaglia on the show today. I just want to say up front that the opinions Chiara is sharing today are her own, of course, and they're not intended to represent her employer's views or positions. Chiara is a biology PhD turned program and community manager who engages communities through various platforms. She's currently manager of scientific programs at Columbia University's Mortimer Zuckerman Mind Brain Behavior Institute, where she oversees the design, creation, and administration of scientific programs that advance the scientific, intellectual, and academic priorities of the Institute. As part of her role, Chiara leads efforts that produce scientific career and professional development programs to support the Institute's neuroscientists and researchers at a variety of career stages, from graduate students to postdocs to faculty members, including seminar series that she organizes, workshops, and a course about business concepts for scientists, among other professional development opportunities focused on transferable skills, which obviously are just so important. Recently, Chiara was selected to receive training from AAAS in the fundamentals of scientific community management and organizational culture change. And she published a guidebook for community managers and event planners about building community at scientific events. Chiara is the executive president of Know Science, an international science advocacy and public engagement organization working to share science and scientific research with a non scientist audience. Served as a science instructor for high school students, in which she developed a portfolio of lectures combined with experiments at the bench designed to introduce teenagers to the world of experimental biology and neuroscience. Previously, Chiara was a postdoctoral researcher at Columbia University Medical Center, where she studied the role of molecular motors in brain development. She earned her PhD in biochemistry and structural biology at the European Molecular Biology Laboratory in Heidelberg, Germany, her Master of Science and her Bachelor of Applied Science in Cell and Molecular Biology from the University of Rome. Welcome to the show, Kiera. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much, Mark, for inviting me. It is my pleasure to be here today.
So, the first thing I want to ask you is just if you could tell our audience a bit more about what you are working on at the Zuckerman Mind Brain Behavior Institute, sort of your priorities at the Institute.
Yeah. So at the Zuckerman Institute, where I'm program manager, we believe that academic administrators play a key role in training the next generation of professionals in STEM. And so we want to provide a nurturing environment that supports scientists as really the future leaders in science, technology, and society. And in particular, the mission of our office, that is the programs office, is to create a plethora of scientific programs that support the researchers of the Institute in their scientific and professional career at large. These programs include seminar series, career development events, workshops, and courses about, among other things, science communication, leadership, and lab management skills. And the vision of what we do is to build for this scientific community a home that really brings out their best science, that brings out bold and innovative ideas that eventually lead to transformative discoveries that support society. And to achieve this, so to foster this community of scientists and researchers, we do our programming by adopting a community engagement framework. This means that we systematically ask for input and seek feedback from the community to make sure that the programs truly satisfy their needs. We also sometimes directly involve them in co designing portions of the programs, and we give them full agency and resources to plan and run their own programs. An example of this is a successful Zuckerman Institute postdoc seminar series, which we call ZIPS, And it's entirely managed and run by postdocs and really, really successful. The fundamental aspect of the community engagement perspective is for us really to not leave anyone out.
Mhm.
It's our duty to cultivate opportunities for everyone across different spectra of diversity to feel included and to thrive. We keep this in mind at every step of the way, when we design, when we communicate, and when we run the programs. We strive for everyone to feel welcome and empowered to participate, to collaborate, and to own their own ideas. This process takes time to develop, of course. It's fundamentally based on mutual trust.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I believe that we in the programs office have worked really hard for a solid couple of years to eventually, gradually, hopefully earn such trust. And I think we've done this by being open and transparent about our goals, our values, and the processes of how we do things, by keeping constantly an open line of dialogue, and by eventually delivering what we're committed to creating.
I love it. I love it. Those are such wonderful principles and philosophies, to guide your work. And I want to ask you about your own personal professional, transition from a biology PhD turned program and community turned program and community manager. And what led you to decide that you wanted to focus on professional development and community building, for example? And then maybe after that, kind of a little bit more about how you managed that transition, perhaps if there were mentors that supported you along the way and how you went about finding those people. But first off, sort of what led you to decide this is where you really wanted to focus professionally?
Yeah. So during my postdoc, I rapidly realized that doing only bench research was not for me.
Hmm.
It was definitely for me during my PhD. I was fully dedicated to research and to science, but then during my postdoc, something changed. I had just moved, from another continent,
Hmm.
from Europe to America, and I was feeling very lonely. I felt like it was really hard for me to connect with any group of people.
Hmm.
So I needed something else that would make me feel connected with any community, not just the rest of the scientific community at Columbia, but also other networks of people outside of academia.
Hmm.
And only being in the lab wasn't going to help. So I joined lots of programs and activities to start getting involved in science outreach and public engagement. First, as an after school instructor, teaching experimental biology to high school students from the Harlem and the Bronx. And then as a member of the science outreach nonprofit organization called No Science, where I currently lead a team of volunteers to produce public programming that bring general audiences closer to the science that we do in the lab. So that was one aspect that I started developing already at the postdoc time. But
Hmm.
yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask. And then you've got to manage that transition because you're a postdoc and you're finding that your passion now is moving in this particular direction. So how did you manage that?
Yeah, so the answer is not a great one. So I managed by working really, really hard, too many hours that
Hmm.
I am actually embarrassed to confess. Working lots of weekends because I felt like I just could not do the work that I was supposed to do and that I was paid for in the lab. So the usual number of hours that I would spend in the lab would be accompanied by lots of evenings, nights, and weekenders. Um, Dedicating time to the no science work.
Mm-hmm.
But that wasn't actually the only thing. So I not only realized this passion for connecting with other audiences, not just the audiences of scientists. At the same time, because I realized that I didn't want to continue on the traditional academic career path to eventually become a faculty member,
Hmm.
nor did I want to continue doing research at all, I started attending every possible career and professional development event just to learn what kind of jobs are available out
Hmm.
there.
Hmm.
So I didn't really have much of an idea yet.
Sure.
Um, and so Columbia's Office of Postdoctoral Affairs, they organized a lot of different events, like career panels, and I attended all of those. And in parallel, I realized that this aspect of helping postdocs figure out their path was a very appealing one to me. Like at the same time, I was being the learner, and also I was understanding that that is something that I might like doing. And so I became very, very involved with the Columbia University Postdoctoral Society, which is a society of postdocs run by postdocs for postdocs. And I organized professional development opportunities for postdocs while serving in that society, mostly focused on science communication and storytelling, because I was bringing in the expertise that I was developing at No Science.
Oh, right,
So
right, right.
yeah, so there was these two parallel tracks, these two parallel experiences, the doing science outreach and science communication with No Science, but also starting to develop these programming opportunities for postdocs as part of the postdoc society. And these opportunities weren't just great chances for me to simply get to know people, establish new social and professional relationships. There were also incredible opportunities for me to start developing managing communication and leadership skills that
Hmm.
would have eventually been extremely useful for job applications. Um, and I eventually really narrowed down that what I enjoyed doing was quote unquote organizing things,
Right.
organizing events.
Uh-huh.
I really enjoyed the leading people aspect.
Hmm.
And I narrowed it down to enjoying organizing career and professional development activities for academic researchers, because slowly but surely I really became invested in this mission of improving the training environment
Hmm.
for academic researchers. So at the time, when I figured what I liked doing, the next $1 million question was going to be, what is the job that actually allows me to do that?
Sure. Right.
And so I had to then proactively go out there and start doing informational interviews.
Hmm.
I also attended the famous New York career fair called What Can You Be with a PhD? And that's where I actually learned for the first time that there is a career path called administration in higher education,
Hmm.
and that a program coordinator or a program manager job in that field would allow me to really combine my passion for organizing things, organizing events, and be able to support scientists and researchers during their training in academia.
That
Yeah, go ahead.
it's really funny because a lot of times you ask people about their career trajectory, and in retrospect it always seems like it was a linear progression, but it never is. I mean, it never
Yeah.
is. In the rearview mirror, it may look that way, but you were finding out, learning about your passion, then of course how to connect that to positions and so forth. Did you feel like you had supportive mentors to help you along the way?
I wish I wish I could actually say that I had mentors.
Hmm.
I think I rather had advisors. So people that I picked along the way because I had identified the type of field that I was interested in, the people that worked in those fields, and
Hmm.
I contacted them on a one-off case by case
Hmm. Hmm.
scenario, and maybe ask for informational interviews and have conversations about how did they land that job, what their daily job looked like,
Hmm.
and if it was really something that I was interested in.
Hmm.
So by that time I realized that I was interested in two big fields. There was this higher education management in administration and higher education, but there was still the science communication and science outreach aspect, right?
Mhm,
So I really want to give a shout out to Erika Peterson, the director of the Office of Postdoctoral Affairs at Columbia,
mhm,
and to Ginny Garbarino, the director of Rocky DU Science Outreach at Rockefeller University,
mhm.
because they were really my two lights that guided me through lots of conversations and eventually making me understand that I enjoyed the administration and higher education aspect a little bit more than the science engagement part, which I anyway keep on doing during my free time.
Right, right, right. So interesting. And thanks for sharing those folks. The university system, as you know, and you may be experiencing this yourself because you're in the environment. It's really in the process of massive change. As a result of a variety of factors, including, of course, the pandemic. And your training work and transferable skills is just so important. Such an emphasis that you talk about, particularly during this turbulent time. And I'm wondering if you could share your perspectives on this dynamic, meaning, is the increasing need, the increasing need for natural and social science PhDs and trainees to learn skills such as business concepts for scientists, which I thought was a great topic, that you've put together as part of your training programs.
Yeah. So I can speak for the scientific academic system, maybe just as a subcategory of the
Hmm.
whole university system. And I love this question because I think with this, you really get into the core of the issue that scientists and researchers cannot afford to just think about and just do science in a way that is completely detached from society, completely detached from cultural awareness and sensitivity, and also from notions of emotional intelligence.
Hmm.
So the so-called soft skills that I mean are actually incredibly important
Hmm.
skills. We don't have to overlook them. We just can't afford to overlook them.
Right.
Leading a research lab as a principal investigator and a member requires way more than just thinking about science.
Hmm.
So requires management and leadership skills to make sure that the lab members can actually make the research continue, that they are properly equipped. So I'm talking financial planning, budget management, grant writing. These are just
Hmm.
basic things from a merely materialistic point of view. Um, Moving on to social skills, which are equally crucial to lead a lab. Without emotional intelligence and notions of cultural sensitivity, even training on diversity, equity, and inclusion, how can we hope that our labs are truly welcoming environments for trainees to grow and thrive as the
Hmm.
future generation of scientists? How can we hope that they feel included and nurtured? And of course, like not least, science communication skills. Researchers have the social responsibility to build public trust in science and in the scientific research enterprise at large. We see it nowadays with the COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. It's obvious.
Hmm.
We have a responsibility to start and continue an open dialogue about the processes of science and their effects on society with the society at large. So science communication skills, absolutely.
Right. Also important, everything that you mentioned. And it's interesting too, because, the term soft skills, yeah, you paused on that. That's what people call them. They are essential skills.
Yeah.
And sometimes soft skills that reference may have a bit of a negative connotation. However, it was interesting because I had interviewed another guest who did a study on emotional intelligence for within the biotech industry. And one of the things that they looked at was what is the origin of the term soft skills.
Oh,
And it turns out that it goes back to the military when in the US military, when they were trying to figure out, the skills that they needed in their, among their population. And they basically just said, we have certain skills that are hard skills, which just means that you're working on a machine that's hard, like made out of metal, maybe.
uh-huh.
Or
Uh-huh.
if you're not, then it's just a soft skill because it's not a hard skill. So there was never any kind of value judgment that was placed on it initially. But I sometimes sense, in the references, sometimes when people talk about it, it does have a bit of a disparaging, even if it's a subtle, term, which is why I would just say these are essential skills, like you said, they really are.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I had never thought about it's basically the dichotomy software hardware.
Right, right.
Yeah, and definitely like how soft skills, and even if you just list the skills in resumes, how sometimes this go through gender issues,
Hmm.
and you will have people identifying as female maybe using more of these adjectives and characteristics, and that can in turn sometimes have effects if the
Hmm.
hiring manager hasn't gone through training about implicit bias and
Hmm.
things like that.
Hmm. Hmm. I want to shift to your academic experience. Obviously, you earned your PhD abroad in Germany. And I'm wondering if you could share what your challenges were as you continued your training and embarked on your career in the US, coming to a different continent and, how you dealt with that.
Yes. My PhD at the European Molecular Biology Lab was really one in a lifetime experience.
Mm.
I'm even smiling now while I talk about it. The cohorts of PhD students that are recruited there are very international and diverse.
Mhm.
And this allowed me to start some great friendships that still continue today. And also the scientific and training environment was incredibly welcoming, and I was able to carry out amazing cutting edge research. Obviously, Germany being part of the European Union and also being Heidelberg, a very international city with lots of research institutes that really attract bright minds from all over the world,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really experience much of a culture shock at the time. I was actually extremely excited to start making new friends that didn't speak my native language, that
Mm-hmm.
didn't share my background. It was the first time that I was experiencing this coming from Italy, and it was refreshing and thrilling. But I must confess that when I moved to the States straight after my PhD, I realized how much I had underestimated the cultural difference that I would eventually experience. And definitely looking back, this was really naive of me. It took me quite some time, lots of book reading, to finally start keeping up and start understanding the culture and the history of this country, at least not from a Eurocentric
Mm-hmm.
perspective, which was the one that I had been exposed to in school and the one I was just embedded in my culture.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So I'm talking, realizing that things I had always given for granted as undeniable rights in my home country, like education and healthcare are accessible to everyone, are actually privileges in this country. And I systematically draw a line between myself and other individuals from certain backgrounds that are less privileged. So this awakening gave me extreme discomfort. And while I can't say that that discomfort has gone, because it will probably never go, I believe that I'm finding the energy to turn that discomfort into what it takes me to be vocal and to do
Mm-hmm.
things granted by my privilege to eventually make change where I can.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, I'm not a citizen of this country, so I cannot vote. I cannot exercise my thought
Mm-hmm.
by voting. But the part that I can play is to work to make the academic scientific enterprise more diverse, more inclusive, and equitable through my daily job. And I can also work to spread science facts and not just misinformation
Mm-hmm.
through my volunteer role with No Science.
Mm-hmm.
And I can promise you that I really work tirelessly to do so. Of course, on top of this, there are particular challenges that come with being an international in the US, which are sadly the current anti-immigration policies and the xenophobic agenda of
Mm-hmm.
this administration.
True, and there are so many. There are lots of large populations of non-U.S. citizen PhDs. Of course, you were part of that environment, and I wonder, just kind of building off of what you just said, Kiara, what kind of advice you have for listeners who may be facing some of these same or similar challenges that you experienced. You talked a little bit about a lot of book reading, and I'm interested to have you elaborate more on that and something similar aspects that helped you really feel like you were starting to move forward in that regard.
Yeah, so I mean, the scientific academic world in the States is extremely international at the undergrad, at the PhD, at the postdoc level.
Mm-hmm.
The National Postdoc Association actually shows numbers. The majority of postdocs in the US are not US citizens, and still they are the scientific force that drives science forward. So these anti-immigration policies are not only very upsetting because more often than not, they literally destroy lives, they dismantle families, they burn career opportunities. They're also fundamentally just counterproductive. And these past years have been really troubling, besides just the past months, especially
Mm-hmm.
besides the novel coronavirus pandemic, which already tells you that I am a bit privileged because, white European immigrants have been through troubles with immigration laws only recently, while immigrants from other countries, and especially immigrants of color, have been systematically given a hard time.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely realized that. Um, I don't really have a good advice in the sense that the information and the news change so rapidly that the one thing I'll say is to best rely on a number of different sources and
Mm-hmm.
cross-check information. So whenever I would read something in the news, typically very upsetting, I would always cross-check with the university immigration office and lawyers at least. So double, triple checking. And also sometimes it just, if you need to take time off and not think about this because it's so upsetting, also just do that. At some point it became just too much
Right.
to
Right.
keep up, and every day read something upsetting. So take care of your mental health if you need to.
Those are two really important pieces of advice. So thank you for sharing that. Now, thinking about your training curriculum, which we talked a little bit about earlier, I'm wondering if you kind of think across the different programs, and there's such a great diversity of programs that you are developing, and I'm sure you have more on the horizon. But thinking about your current training curriculum, where do you typically find the biggest areas in need of further, say, development or improvement among, your population of participants?
I love this question because it gives me the start to my favorite topic.
Good.
And an area where at the Zuckerman Institute we're investing particularly time and energy is mentorship training.
Hmm.
And mentorship, I use intentionally the word mentorship and not mentoring because I want to encompass both the practice of mentoring a mentee as a mentor and also the practice of being a mentee.
Hmm.
So we run training for both mentors and mentees, and I am personally involved in facilitating these workshops where we illustrate and discuss best practices to improve the relationship within mentors and mentees. We cover strategies for effective communication, for setting expectations, assessing understanding, gaining cultural sensitivity, and not least to foster independence, the independence of the mentee. It's indeed the mentor's role at the end of the day to guide the mentee towards being a well-rounded independent researcher and scientist. But it's also the mentee who has agency to mentor up,
Hmm.
to be proactive in setting the direction of the mentorship relationship by knowing what they want and where they want to go. So with this training, we want to make mentees realize that they have agency and they can do that, and we give them the tools. And we believe that by taking this approach from both the mentor and the mentee perspective, we can really increase the quality of the relationship between mentors and mentees and ultimately just favor the happiness and the success of the mentees.
Wonderful.
And I just want to mention that
Mhm,
we're
please.
launching the novel Zuckerman Institute postdoc program
Mhm,
these days. And indeed, just as a testament of this, the first programmatic components where we focused on have been a peer mentor program
mhm,
and a framework for postdocs to create a personal board of advisors, which is to say, a circle of mentors, of
mhm.
sponsors, coaches, advocates that can truly support them in developing as a scientist and professional.
Excellent. Excellent. And I'm happy to include information about that in the show notes for this episode and any links that you think would be helpful for people who are listening and wondering how they can get further information.
Thank you. Yes.
So, as we wrap up, Kira, I want to focus on science communication, another of your passions. You have a lot of expertise in this area. You've taught science to younger students. You're engaging with communities outside the university setting who don't have a scientific frame of reference. And I'm wondering for listeners who are particularly interested in science communication, what you think could be one thing or even things that a listener could do today to be a better communicator of their science to general audiences.
The first thing I'll say is really not very original and not very surprising, but it's worth saying. It's something that every communicator will tell you, which is to keep very well in mind who the audience is and what exactly the goal of the communication is.
Mhm.
So, quote unquote, general audiences or audiences of known scientists, which I have myself utilized in this conversation now, is actually a very generic term per se.
Mhm.
You want to ask yourself, are these audiences already maybe exposed a little bit to some scientific background or not? You ideally want to know this because while you want to avoid using unnecessarily complicated words like the jargon, you also don't want to talk people down.
Mhm.
Tone does matter really a lot, and it will make the difference between drawing someone closer to what you're saying and making them more interested or drawing them even far apart. So sometimes a few words of jargon are actually appropriate. You can
Mhm.
include them in your communication and explain what they mean.
Right.
um, and at No Science, whenever we organize events, we really try to dig deeper and understand what kind of audience we have in front of us.
Mhm.
So, talking to families with children is different than talking to just an audience of adults or an audience of high schoolers or middle schoolers. So there's no such thing as just one type of general audience or general public.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, the second thing that I'd like to say is to avoid as much as possible unilateral communication, based on the assumption that the scientists know everything and the audience just has to listen. It's funny because we as scientists are trained to do exactly this in the academic scientific enterprise. We are trained to be the absolute experts, to be the ones who know everything about one subject and to debate and debate and debate and win such debates. But that's not how the most effective science communication will happen if the other party is not a scientist. So it really needs to happen in a bilateral way where the scientists are at least open to the possibility of learning from the
Mhm.
audience,
Mhm.
definitely listening and empathizing with them.
Mhm.
We can't just assume that we throw a bunch of scientific facts that might actually be really hard to swallow and assume that without any empathy
Mhm.
and assume that they'll just say, okay, cool, I get that.
Right.
Um,
Right. Right.
so I would like to encourage the listeners of this podcast to check out the work that Paula Croxon is doing in the Public Programs Office, where I work at the
Mhm.
Zuckerman Institute,
Mhm.
and also the work that Ginny Garbarino is doing at RuckEDU, at Rockefeller
Mhm.
University. They lead amazing teams that are doing a great job at producing excellent programs that truly connect with the public. So I'm learning a lot from them.
Fantastic. And you implied that you talked about empathy.
Mhm.
When I'm working with scientists or engineers and talking to them about communication, how to be a stronger communicator, I say, well, the data is really only part of the equation, right? There has to be,
Mhm.
there has to be this emotional component too, which oftentimes leads to specificity and things that the audience can really relate to in their everyday. And I recently interviewed for the show. Podcast is not Oh yeah, but as a little preview, I recently interviewed the former head of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration in the U.S. federal government. So this is OSHA, and it's part of the Department of Labor. And he is the longest serving director in the history of OSHA, which has responsibility for making sure that workers are safe and workplaces are safe. He did a lot of testifying before Congress, and he actually got good at it. And he really likes doing it. He liked doing it, which he said was unheard of in his administration and anyone else in the administration. But he basically distilled this down to the following: is he said, "Story first, science second."
Yeah.
And I thought that was just a great way of expressing how to be an effective communicator about complicated, often scientific topics.
Yes, storytelling, absolutely. As Paula Croxon will say, and I just mentioned her, and she definitely taught me this, and I have
Mhm.
so much more to really practice to be able to do that. Facts, like science facts, we think that they are not debatable because they are facts.
Mhm.
But for people, it's actually stronger if you tell stories.
Mhm.
Personal stories, those are absolutely undeniable.
Right.
How can people say no, it's not true
Mhm.
that you experienced that?
Right. Right.
So that really reaches the core of people who are not used to thinking by facts like scientists and researchers are.
And thanks for teasing that out, because that kind of description is not typical, in the sense that scientists are often told to tell stories, but it's not explained the way you just explained it. It's sort of indisputable. And actually, this is personal experience here, and I'm an expert in me, right? So I know it happened.
Mhm.
And so I really appreciate you highlighting that aspect of storytelling, and why, why it is so, one reason why it is so powerful.
Yeah, I encourage the listeners of this podcast to really check out the work that Paula Croxon, Diana Lee, and Alyssa Meyers are doing in the Public Programs Office at the Zuckerman Institute. This team is doing an amazing job at producing excellent programs that truly connect to the public. Yeah.
Chiara, this has been a fantastic conversation, and I really appreciate you setting aside the time in your busy schedule to share all this knowledge and expertise. I mean, we could talk for a lot longer about these topics, and your journey so far has been really inspiring. And the information you shared today, I know, is going to make an impact on listeners. So, thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Mark. This has been really fun for me. It's been an opportunity for me to put my thoughts in order. And this is actually only my second year in this job and in this new career that I started after leaving my postdoc. So
Wow.
I hope this is just a start.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you've done so much. And I know there's a lot more to come. So, listeners, I also want to thank you for tuning into this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.